A group of 3 police officers were laughing, openly, inside a courtroom. Not quietly. Not discreetly. Loud, mocking laughs echoing off the walls, aimed directly at a black man seated in silence, his wrists still sore from the tightness of the handcuffs. He wasn't speaking. He hadn't said a word since being brought in. But the smirks on their faces weren't because of something he did, they were because of who they thought he was. One of them leaned forward just enough and whispered, loud enough for the courtroom mic to catch, "Should have just stayed in the projects, man. Now you'll be lucky if you get 3 meals a day in prison." Another officer chuckled, nudging his partner with his elbow, "This one swears he's a hero, probably watched too many army movies on BT." He sat still. Calm. Too calm. Not because he was numb, but because he was calculating. Because he knew the truth. But no one else in that courtroom did. Not the judge. Not the jury. Not the officers who arrested him without checking the most basic of facts. Not the public defender who barely looked him in the eye. No one had taken the time to really see him. They only saw the color of his skin, the name on the file, and the accusation, "Suspect detained," matching the identity of a wanted fugitive. Same name. Same skin color. That was all it took. And that was all they needed to throw him in a cell, strip him of his dignity, and laugh in his face as they paraded him into court like he was trash. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't know, is that they were about to make the biggest mistake of their lives. Because the man sitting silently before them wasn't just some ordinary citizen. He wasn't just a civilian confused by the legal system. He wasn't a scared young man who'd roll over and take whatever sentence they decided to dump on him. He was something else. Something they couldn't possibly imagine. Something they wouldn't believe even if they saw it on paper. He had been silent long enough. As the prosecution finished laying out its lazy, paper-thin argument, the judge sighed and glanced at him. "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" There was a moment of silence. Then, finally, he stood. Calm. Composed. He reached into his pocket, carefully, deliberately, and unfolded a small, worn card. The courtroom guards tensed, unsure of what he was pulling out. The judge's eyes narrowed. The officers rolled their eyes. Then he spoke. And his voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. "I'm not the man you think I am. I'm a decorated Navy SEAL. I've served 3 tours overseas. I've led classified missions that kept this country safe while you were sleeping comfortably in your beds. I've received honors that not one person in this room has earned. And yet, you dragged me in here like an animal because someone with my name committed a crime. You didn't verify. You didn't ask. You just assumed. Because of my skin. Because of your bias. Because of your arrogance." A long silence followed. The judge leaned forward. The prosecutor blinked, stunned. The courtroom was dead quiet. He wasn't finished. "In my 20 years of service, I've looked death in the face more times than I can count. But nothing compares to the feeling of walking into my own country's courtroom and being laughed at by the people who swore to protect it. You don't know me. But you will." The entire room shifted. One of the officers muttered under his breath, trying to dismiss it. "Anybody can make up a story." That's when he dropped the card on the table. A government-issued ID. A badge of service. The emblem of the United States Navy SEALs. Verified. Scanned. Confirmed. The judge's face turned pale. The bailiff's expression changed. Whispers erupted through the crowd. The courtroom was no longer in control. He was. And suddenly, everything changed. Because now, this wasn't just a case of mistaken identity. This was a federal humiliation. This was the justice system exposed in its most shameful moment. A man who risked his life for his country, nearly sentenced for a crime he didn't commit, all because nobody bothered to ask the right questions. And the men who laughed, those officers, they weren't laughing anymore. An emergency recess was called. The court needed time. Time to figure out how to explain this to the public. Time to prepare for the storm that was coming. But it was too late. The story had already leaked. The truth was out. News crews were already circling the courthouse. Phones buzzed with footage. Headlines were forming. And for the first time, the balance of power tilted. Because the same system that tried to bury him, now owed him everything. But that was just the beginning. Behind the scenes, investigations were launched. The judge, rattled by his own oversight, filed a formal apology. An independent review of the officer's conduct was initiated. Internal affairs got involved. And the deeper they dug, the darker it got. It wasn't just about this one case. Patterns emerged. A history of misconduct. Fabricated reports. Racial profiling. And suddenly, those three officers, once so sure of their power, found themselves at the center of a firestorm. This wasn't a mistake. This was a reckoning. But here's the real question. Did justice stop at an apology? Were those officers truly held accountable for what they did? Did the man who was dragged into court like a criminal find the closure he deserved, or did he decide to take matters into his own hands? Because here's the thing, when a man who's trained to survive behind enemy lines is humiliated by the very people he swore to protect, he doesn't forget. And in the chapters that follow, you'll see just how far one man can go, not just to clear his name, but to flip the entire system upside down. So now the question is, what really happened after that courtroom went silent? What did he do that left the entire country speechless? And what became of the officers who thought he was just another name on a file? You'll want to stay until the end to find out. Because this isn't just a story. It's a warning. And a message. You never know who you're laughing at, until it's too late. Before we begin, we want to take a moment to speak directly to every black viewer watching this video. Here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism and injustice. This channel is a safe space where real stories are told, where pain is acknowledged, and where powerful comebacks are celebrated. If you've ever felt overlooked, judged, or silenced, we see you, we hear you, and we stand with you. Now, get ready for a story that will shake you. Hit that subscribe button and join a community that believes in justice, redemption, and the power of truth. Enjoy the story. His name was Malik Thompson, and from the outside, you wouldn't think much of him at first glance, maybe just another black man moving quietly through the world, dressed in simple clothes, had always slightly bowed, as if he had learned the hard way that being too visible could get you hurt. He was the kind of man who drew very little attention, not because he lacked presence, but because he had learned how to control it. His silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. Malik had spent the last few years living in the quieter outskirts of Charlotte, North Carolina, a city with roots both deep and divided, a place where history hung heavy in the air and justice often seemed to pick and choose. He lived alone in a modest two-bedroom townhouse on the west side of the city. His neighbors knew him only as the guy who always left early, came back late, and didn't ask for much. He kept his lawn neat, nodded respectfully at elders, and carried himself with a kind of discipline that stood out only if you were paying close enough attention. Most people weren't. Malik worked part-time as a volunteer coordinator at a local youth center, a job he took not for the money, but for the connection. Every afternoon, kids from the neighborhood would pour into that little building on the corner of Burton and 8th Street, and he'd be there waiting. He ran boxing sessions in the back, taught leadership skills to teenagers caught between choices, and made sure the fridge was always full. For the kids, he was simply Coach Malik. They didn't know anything about his past, and he never brought it up. Not because it was a secret, he just believed in living forward. He believed in earning respect through action, not titles. And so, day after day, he did what he could to lift the next generation without ever drawing the spotlight. But shadows have a way of catching up, especially when the system has been trained to confuse quiet dignity with guilt. It all started on a Monday morning. The kind of morning that didn't feel any different from the ones before. Malik had driven downtown for a DMV appointment, something mundane, something routine. He was wearing a black hoodie, jeans, and worn-out sneakers. As he waited in line, he noticed a few cops outside the building, parked in a black and white cruiser, sipping coffee. He didn't think anything of it. Until one of them walked in, glanced at him, and froze. A few moments later, Malik was asked to step outside. No explanation. No accusation. Just a simple command, "Sir, can you come with us?" At first, he thought it was a mistake. Maybe a misunderstanding. Maybe they thought his car was parked illegally. But when the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists and he was pushed against the hood of their car, his body stiffened. He didn't resist. He didn't argue. He just asked, calmly, "What's this about?" The officer smirked, not even bothering to look him in the eye, and said, "You know exactly what this is about." And just like that, the world around him shifted. The officers were Sergeant Brad Cutler, Officer Jason McNeil, and Officer Rick Travers, 3 men with matching arrogance and a history of quiet complaints swept under the rug. To them, Malik wasn't a man. He was a type. A silhouette. A threat. And the fact that he didn't raise his voice, that he didn't beg or lash out, only made them mock him more. In the back of the patrol car, they laughed, called him Slick Malik, joked about how long he'd last in county. One of them even took a photo of him through the mirror and sent it to someone, snickering. "Got him," he said. Dude looked scared. They booked him on the spot. No fingerprint match, no thorough ID check, just a quick database scan and a lazy assumption. The suspect they were looking for, a fugitive wanted in connection to a robbery and assault, had the same name. That was all it took. Malik Thompson, 6 feet 2 inches, black male. Never mind the difference in age, or the clean record, or the fact that Malik had never even been to the part of town where the crime took place. Once the name was entered, the system did what it always does to black men who match a profile, it swallowed him whole. He spent the next 48 hours in a cold, fluorescent-lit holding cell. No phone call. No lawyer. No explanation. When the guards passed his tray of food under the door, they didn't meet his eyes. When he asked to speak to someone, they told him to sit down and wait. And he did. Patiently. Not because he was used to it, but because he had something stronger than anger. He had control. Meanwhile, outside that jail cell, the world moved on. His job at the youth center wondered why he hadn't shown up. The kids were confused. One of them texted him 3 times, "You good?" Malik never answered. Back at the precinct, the arrest was logged, processed, and passed along to the courts without so much as a second glance. Another day, another statistic. They never stopped to think, maybe we got the wrong guy. They didn't care. They never do. By the time his court date was set, Malik had already been passed through a dozen hands. From intake to processing to holding to arraignment. No one stopped. No one listened. Not even his appointed public defender, a tired woman named Denise who skimmed his file and said, "It's gonna be hard to fight this without some kind of alibi." Malik tried to explain. Gave her names, addresses, even CCTV footage he remembered from the DMV. She nodded, uninterested. "I'll see what I can do," she said, already half out the door. The courtroom was small, old, and worn down. The kind of place where justice felt less like a principle and more like a performance. Malik sat in the defendant's seat, wearing a beige jumpsuit, his hands folded calmly in front of him. Across the aisle, the 3 officers who arrested him were seated in the front row, whispering and chuckling. The judge was a white man in his 60s, heavy glasses, weary expression. The prosecutor looked no older than 25, fresh out of law school, hungry for a win. And Malik? He was alone. Isolated. Misunderstood. As the prosecutor began laying out the charges, the officers couldn't help themselves. Their voices were low, but audible. Guy thinks he's innocent. Hilarious. Should have seen his face when we cuffed him. Bet he cries when they read the sentence. Their words were poison, designed to humiliate, to degrade. And yet, Malik sat there, unmoved. Not because he wasn't affected. But because he knew, deep down, that the truth doesn't stay buried forever. But the court didn't care about truth. Not at first. They cared about evidence. And all they had was a name. Malik Thompson. An all too common name. The prosecutor argued that the physical resemblance matched. That the timeline was believable. That Malik had no alibi, according to the initial report. No mention of checking his military records. No interest in verifying his identity through biometric scans. Just a black man with a name that matched, and a courtroom full of people too lazy, or too prejudiced, to look deeper. And that's where the story begins to turn. Not with the sound of a gavel. Not with a dramatic outburst. But with a single, deliberate breath. Malik raised his head. Slowly. His eyes scanned the room. He wasn't angry. He wasn't broken. He was ready. He had endured the humiliation. The disrespect. The assumptions. And now, it was time to speak. But that moment, that reveal, that was still to come. Because before the courtroom could discover who Malik Thompson truly was, they had to finish believing who they thought he was. And that belief, so deeply rooted in bias, was about to be shattered in the most public, irreversible way. And when it did, the silence that followed would echo across the nation. The courtroom had fallen into a rhythm. Routine. Rehearsed. One case after another, lives measured in files, futures decided with barely a glance. And amid that flow, Malik Thompson had become just another folder on the judge's desk. Another case number. Another black man on trial. His public defender, Denise, had tried, barely. She had filed a weak motion for mistaken identity, which was dismissed in under a minute. She had requested time to gather alibi evidence, but the court calendar was full and the judge wasn't interested. He waved it off. If he's innocent, he'll have his chance. But everyone in that room knew the truth, innocent or not, the damage had already been done. In the back row, Brad Cutler leaned against the polished wooden rail, arms crossed over his chest, that same smug look on his face. Jason McNeil sat beside him, flipping through a copy of the case printout, whispering under his breath. Rick Travers chuckled every few minutes, nudging his partners whenever the judge looked disapprovingly at Malik. They weren't even pretending to hide their contempt. To them, this wasn't a trial, it was entertainment. Malik sat still, his expression unreadable. He wasn't broken, but he wasn't untouched either. There was a kind of sadness in his eyes that comes only from knowing too well how fragile justice really is. He looked around and saw how easily the system had moved to crush him. He had no family in the courtroom. No supporters. Just strangers in cheap suits passing judgment on a life they didn't care to understand. At the lunch break, Malik sat alone in the holding area behind the courtroom. The walls were concrete gray, the floors stained with decades of neglect. Denise walked in, carrying a small folder, her heels clicking with nervous energy. She didn't sit. She didn't look him in the eye. "They're not budging," she said flatly. "Your DMV appointment isn't time-stamped. The footage takes 48 hours to request. They've got 3 officers swearing they arrested you near the crime scene, and the judge believes them." Malik leaned forward slightly, his voice quiet but firm. I told you. I was at the DMV. I gave you the address. I gave you the people who saw me. You didn't follow up. Denise hesitated, her fingers tapping the file. There's nothing concrete I can submit before sentencing. They want to move fast. You're facing 5 to 7 if convicted. We could maybe argue it down to probation if you take a plea. Malik's face didn't change, but his voice hardened. You want me to say I did something I didn't do? Just so they can move on. Denise paused. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. They both knew that's exactly what was expected of him. Plead guilty, avoid jail, accept the label of a criminal, and disappear into the background. Malik stood slowly, and for the first time since his arrest, there was a flicker of fire behind his eyes. You tell them I'm not signing a damn thing. If I go down, it won't be quiet. She didn't respond. She simply nodded, muttered something about doing her best, and walked out. Back in the courtroom, the judge resumed with a sigh, clearly irritated by the pace of the proceedings. The prosecution called another witness, an officer who had seen Malik near the scene of the crime. The description was vague, the timeline thin. The defense didn't challenge it. Denise didn't push. She barely asked 3 questions before sitting down again. The judge scribbled in his notebook. The jury, tired and disengaged, blinked slowly like this was just another day. But Malik's eyes scanned the room like a soldier assessing the terrain. He wasn't waiting anymore. He was watching. Calculating. The truth burned at the back of his throat, and every second that passed without it being spoken only fueled what was building inside him. Later that afternoon, during a recess, one of the guards escorting him back to the holding area made a snide remark. Should have thought twice before getting cute with the cops. Malik stopped walking. He turned his head slowly, met the man's eyes. You ever ask yourself what happens when you handcuff the wrong man? What happens when that man knows exactly how your system works, and how to take it apart? The guard scoffed, tightening his grip on Malik's arm, but there was a hesitation. A flicker of doubt. Word had started to spread. Not in the courtroom. Not in the official proceedings. But elsewhere, quietly. A clerk who had processed Malik's paperwork did a double take on his ID. A name she'd seen before in a very different context. A sealed file, high clearance. She hadn't said anything, not yet. But the whisper had reached a paralegal in the DA's office. It was enough for someone to pull up his record again, this time using a secure database. What they found didn't match the man in the police report. Meanwhile, Denise sat alone at a table in the hallway, her head in her hands. She was exhausted, overworked, and full of guilt. She hadn't believed him. Not fully. Not until she got a call from a contact in the Veteran Affairs office who asked, casually, why didn't you mention your client's military service? That man's got more medals than I can count. Denise froze. What are you talking about? The voice on the other end hesitated, confused. You're defending Malik Thompson, right? Former SEAL, honorably discharged, top security clearance. That's your guy, isn't it? The pieces began to shift. Back inside the courtroom, the judge was growing impatient. We're not going to spend all week on this case. The defendant has had his chance to speak. We'll reconvene tomorrow for closing arguments. As people began to gather their things, Malik stood. He wasn't supposed to. The bailiff took a step forward, but paused when Malik raised his hand, not in defiance, but in control. Your Honor, he said calmly. Before this court decides who I am, I'd like the chance to remind you. The judge raised an eyebrow. You've had ample opportunity, Mr. Thompson. Malik's voice didn't change. But something in his tone made the room fall still. No. You've heard what others say I am. You haven't heard me. The judge hesitated, then gestured for him to proceed. Denise looked up sharply. Something had shifted in the air. Even the officers in the back row stopped whispering. Malik took a breath. He wasn't ready to say everything. Not yet. But the way he stood, the way his presence suddenly seemed to grow inside that room, it was enough to make people pay attention. "I've spent my life serving a country that now pretends not to know me," he said slowly. "I've bled for people who would cross the street to avoid me. I've been in places most of you couldn't find on a map, doing things you'll never hear about, so you could wake up in safety. And now I stand here, accused, mocked, and ignored, because my name happens to match someone else's. Because you saw my skin before you saw my truth." Silence followed. He didn't finish the story. Not yet. But he had begun it. And those who had mocked him were suddenly unsettled. Malik sat down, calm once more. The judge said nothing. The prosecution looked rattled. Denise stared at him like she was seeing him for the first time. The next morning, the courtroom would be full. Not just with the same tired faces, but with new ones. Reporters. Observers. A representative from the Navy. A federal official. Something had shifted behind the scenes. People were asking questions. Files were being reviewed. And Malik was about to speak the truth the entire world needed to hear. Because what was coming next wasn't just a revelation. It was justice, and it was going to hit like a thunderstorm. The courtroom was different that morning. The air was heavier. The silence more tense. Not the usual silence of legal procedure, but the kind that comes right before a storm. Reporters sat in the back rows, their phones quiet, eyes locked forward. A Navy representative in uniform had taken a seat near the prosecution, his presence making even the judge look uncomfortable. The courtroom clerk whispered nervously to the bailiff. Everyone knew something had shifted, but no one wanted to be the first to admit it. Only Malik sat with the same composure he had always carried, but there was something deeper in his gaze now. Not just calm. Not just control. Something else. The stillness of a man who knows what he's about to do will change everything. The judge entered, avoiding eye contact with the observers. His usual stern demeanor felt slightly cracked, like he was bracing for impact. Denise stood beside Malik, noticeably more alert than she had been on previous days. Her hands were steady now. She had learned more in the past 12 hours than she had in the entire trial. The military records that surfaced weren't just impressive, they were undeniable. But Malik hadn't asked her to speak today. He had told her he wanted to handle this himself. She looked over at him once before the session began. "Are you sure you want to do it this way?" Malik's eyes didn't move. "It's the only way they'll listen." The judge called the session to order, his voice carrying less authority than usual. "Mr. Thompson, you've requested to address the court before closing arguments." "I'll allow it, but be brief." Malik rose slowly. The room fell completely still. He walked to the center of the courtroom, not to the stand, not to the defense table, but to the open floor where the jury could see him fully. And then he spoke. Not loud. Not aggressive. But with the kind of control that makes people lean forward, whether they want to or not. "You've heard everything they said about me. You've read the file. You've watched me sit here while people whispered, while they laughed, while they assumed they already knew the end of my story. But you don't know me. Not one of you in this room knows who I am, what I've done, or what I've sacrificed. You saw a name. You saw a face. You saw skin. And you decided I was guilty before I even spoke." He turned slowly toward the jury box. "I spent 20 years in the Navy. 15 of those as a SEAL. I've been deployed in places I can't name, under flags I can't discuss. I've led operations that saved lives and took others. I've held brothers in my arms while they died, whispering their last words to their families. And when I came back home, I didn't ask for a parade. I didn't ask for thanks. I just wanted to live quietly, give back, and stay out of the way. But that wasn't enough, was it? His voice tightened, emotion creeping in. Because one day, I walked into a DMV and never walked back out. Because 3 officers saw my face and decided that was all they needed. They didn't ask me questions. They didn't check the records. They didn't care about facts. They arrested me because my name matched a suspect's and my skin matched their fear. Gasps rippled through the room. The reporters typed faster now. The Navy officer didn't move. Malik turned toward the prosecution. You built your case around that arrest. Around 3 men who swore they knew who I was. Who sat in that back row every day of this trial and laughed while I was humiliated. He looked at them now, Brad Cutler, Jason McNeil, Rick Travers. Their faces were different. Still trying to hold on to smugness, but something else had started to replace it. Something they hadn't felt in years. Fear. The judge interrupted, his voice shaking slightly. Mr. Thompson, do you have evidence to support these claims? Malik didn't blink. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folder, thick, worn, and stamped with a federal seal. He handed it directly to the bailiff, who brought it to the bench. Those are my service records. Verified by the Department of Defense. Inside you'll find commendations, deployment orders, and clearances. There's also a notarized letter from Admiral Riggins, confirming my identity and my current assignment as a federal defense consultant. The judge flipped through the folder, his face growing pale. The courtroom, for a long moment, said nothing. Then Malik turned back to the officers. You wanted to humiliate me. You thought this would end in silence. But you forgot something. I was trained not just to fight, but to observe. I've been watching you since the day you put cuffs on me. I know which of you lied in your statement. I know which of you altered the time of the arrest. I know who took the photo in the back of the cruiser and sent it to a group chat labeled Thugs of the Week. You think that chat's private? You think those messages can't be recovered? Jason McNeil shifted in his seat, glancing at Brad, whose face had gone completely still. Malik stepped forward. You didn't just arrest me. You built your careers on men like me. You mocked my silence because you thought it meant I had no power. But silence isn't weakness. It's patience. The judge looked up now, interrupting again, his voice cracking. Is this an accusation of misconduct against these officers? Malik stared straight ahead. No. It's not an accusation. It's a promise. Because when I walk out of this courtroom, I won't be walking out alone. Internal Affairs has already been contacted. The Federal Inspector General has the group chat logs. My legal team has filed a civil suit. And the Department of Defense has launched an ethics review of this entire proceeding. Your Honor, this court didn't just try the wrong man. It became complicit in trying to erase a life without ever knowing what it stood for. For the first time, Cutler rose to speak. His voice was defiant, but brittle. He's lying. This is all a setup. He's just playing the system. Malik didn't even turn. Denise stood now, taking a single step forward and placing a copy of the same file on the prosecution's desk. He's not lying. And you're not going to talk your way out of this. You're done. The courtroom exploded in noise, reporters shouting questions, the jury stunned, the judge calling for order. But amid all of it, Malik stood still. The moment he had waited for had arrived, not just the exposure of truth, but the collapse of everything they thought they knew about him. He wasn't broken. He was never broken. He was just waiting for the moment when the world would be forced to see him. As the bailiffs cleared the room, the judge recessed the court for a formal review. But the damage had already been done. The story was out. And the men who laughed. They weren't laughing anymore. What came next would redefine not only the fate of those officers, but the entire city. Because this wasn't just justice. It was history being rewritten in real time. And the consequences were only just beginning. The courtroom remained in disarray long after the judge struck the gavel, calling for a recess. No one moved at first. Eyes bounced from Malik to the folder still lying open on the bench, its pages exposed like evidence at a crime scene. The tension was no longer speculative, it had shape now, weight, heat. The air was thick with it. Denise placed her hand gently on Malik's arm, not to hold him back, but to ground herself. "You changed everything in that room," she whispered, voice tight with disbelief. Malik didn't answer right away. He was still staring at the back of the courtroom, where Cutler, McNeil, and Travers now sat slumped and shaken. The shift in power was no longer just symbolic, it was visible. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had begun to form. The press moved fast. The Navy officer who had been seated quietly during the hearing now stood by the entrance, giving short, clipped statements confirming Malik's military background and active federal status. Photographers circled the building like hawks. This was no longer a courtroom drama, it was a national scandal unraveling in real time. The footage of Malik speaking had already been clipped, edited, and blasted across every platform. Decorated Navy SEAL wrongfully tried in mistaken identity case. Hero humiliated by racist officers in courtroom shock. The headlines varied, but the core was the same: America had made a mistake. A deep, ugly, unforgivable one. Malik was escorted to a private conference room while the judge met with legal advisors and federal representatives. Denise followed him in, closing the door softly behind them. For a moment, they stood in silence, surrounded by bookshelves and stale air. Then Denise exhaled and leaned against the table. "I didn't believe you. Not when you first told me. Not really. I thought you were exaggerating or maybe, trying to hold on to pride. But I was wrong. I've never been more wrong." Malik sat across from her, finally allowing himself to breathe deeply. "You weren't the only one. But it's not about belief anymore. It's about what they do next." She nodded slowly, then lowered her voice. "IA is opening an immediate case. The Navy's pushing for a federal misconduct investigation. And the court just received a motion from your legal team to have the charges dismissed with prejudice. It's all moving fast now." Malik stared at the table. It should have never moved at all. At that moment, the door creaked open. A tall man in a gray suit stepped in, Assistant U.S. Attorney Marcus Langford. His tone was direct, measured, and respectful. "Mr. Thompson, I've been asked to speak with you regarding the events of today's proceedings. The Department of Justice is monitoring this situation closely. If you're willing, we'd like to request a formal debrief. There may be grounds to pursue federal action against the arresting officers, the precinct leadership, and possibly others involved." Malik met his gaze. "You think I'm doing this for punishment?" Langford didn't flinch. "I think you're doing this because someone has to. And right now, you're the only person in the room with the moral authority to do it." Malik didn't respond, not immediately. He looked out the small window overlooking the courthouse steps. The crowd had doubled in size. Cameras, voices, signs. But behind all of that noise, he saw one of the kids from the youth center, Jalen. 13 years old, standing with his mother. Holding a sign that read, "I am not a suspect." Malik closed his eyes for a second and swallowed hard. "I'll give you the statement," he said quietly. "But not just about them. About all of it. From the moment I was arrested. From the way they looked at me. From the words they used. This isn't about those 3 men. This is about the system that gave them permission." Langford nodded solemnly. "Understood." Back in the courtroom, the tension hadn't eased, it had evolved. The jury was dismissed for the day, no longer needed. The judge had called for a closed review, and Denise was asked to join. But Malik made a different choice. He requested a meeting, not with the judge, not with the press, but with the officers. Alone. It was an unusual request, and there were hesitations. But given the gravity of what had occurred and the optics now at play, it was approved under strict supervision. A small security room was cleared in the back of the courthouse, and within minutes, Malik stood face to face with the three men who had tried to erase his identity with nothing more than arrogance and paperwork. Brad Cutler looked tired. His jaw clenched, shoulders hunched like a man preparing to be hit. Jason McNeil shifted from foot to foot, glancing around for someone to step in. Rick Travers stood farther back, arms crossed, trying to maintain some kind of composure, but his eyes betrayed him. Malik didn't raise his voice. He didn't move aggressively. He simply stepped forward and looked each of them in the eye. "I don't want an apology," he said firmly. "Because an apology doesn't undo the way you spoke about me. It doesn't remove the handcuffs. It doesn't take away the time I spent in that cell wondering if this was how my story would end. It doesn't clean the stain you tried to put on my name." Cutler's voice cracked as he finally spoke. "We were acting on a warrant. The name matched. Malik cut him off. "You didn't act. You assumed. You joked. You laughed. You degraded me because it made you feel powerful. You never once questioned the process because the process has always worked in your favor." McNeil tried to step forward. "It wasn't personal. We didn't know who you were." "That's the problem," Malik snapped, his voice rising for the first time. "You didn't care who I was. You never do. To you, we're all the same. Dark skin, same name, same outcome. You weren't looking for a suspect. You were looking for someone to blame." Travers stayed silent, but his face was pale now. Malik took a breath, stepped back, and lowered his voice again. "This won't end in this room. You'll face consequences, legal, professional, and personal. You may lose your badges, your pensions, your reputations. And that's justice. But it's not victory. Victory is when the next Malik Thompson doesn't have to explain his humanity to a courtroom." The silence after that was unbearable. The officers didn't speak. They couldn't. There was no defense left. Malik nodded once and turned to leave. As he reached the door, he heard McNeil whisper behind him, voice barely audible. "I didn't know you were important." Malik stopped. Turned. "I was important before you knew my title. That's what you still don't understand." Outside, the world had changed. The press conference that followed was brief but explosive. Langford confirmed a federal investigation. Denise announced the case had been dropped, expunged completely. Malik stood beside her but didn't say much. He didn't need to. His silence spoke louder than any speech ever could. But even as the cameras flashed, and the headlines roared, Malik's eyes scanned the crowd until they found the only thing that mattered, Jalen, still standing with his mother. Malik walked over, crouched to his level, and spoke quietly. "You saw what happened in there?" The boy nodded. Malik smiled softly. "Then you know you never let anyone tell you who you are. You tell them." The boy looked up at him, wide-eyed. "Are you gonna be okay?" Malik stood, placed a hand on his shoulder. "I already am." And though the world would spend days, weeks, even years unpacking what happened in that courtroom, Malik Thompson had already moved on. Because justice wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. In the days that followed, the city of Charlotte was unrecognizable. The air seemed charged with something no one could quite explain, rage, disbelief, shame, pride, all of it mixed together like a storm brewing beneath the surface. News vans lined the street outside the courthouse, networks camped out for updates, hoping for more statements, more fallout, more reckoning. Malik didn't return to the courthouse after the charges were dropped. There was nothing left for him there. The fight had shifted. The courtroom had become just one battlefield in a much larger war, and now, the real work had to begin. But the weight of the moment didn't escape him. He understood that, now more than ever, every step he took from here would echo further than anything he had done before. Inside the city's police department, panic took root. Internal affairs raided the precinct where the arresting officers had worked. Files were pulled, computers seized. Officers whispered nervously in hallways, unsure of how deep the investigation would cut. It wasn't just about 3 men anymore. It was about a pattern, a culture, a quiet machinery of assumptions and abuse that had operated unchecked for far too long. Leadership scrambled to contain the narrative. Press statements were crafted, apologies issued, but it all sounded hollow against the truth that had already taken root in the public's mind. Malik Thompson, a man who had served his country in silence, had been nearly erased by the very system he defended, and now, that system was being forced to face itself in the mirror. Brad Cutler was suspended within 48 hours, pending formal review. Jason McNeil and Rick Travers were placed on administrative leave. All 3 were under federal investigation, not just for wrongful arrest but for obstruction, falsification of records, and violation of civil rights. Malik hadn't asked for any of it directly, but he didn't stop it either. He couldn't. Not after everything. The dilemma began to set in when reporters and activists began referring to him as a symbol. A movement. An example of strength and integrity under pressure. But Malik never wanted to be a symbol. He was tired of being used to tell other people's stories. He didn't want to be the face of injustice or resilience. He just wanted to live in peace. The city council requested a private meeting with him. They wanted to discuss potential reforms, police accountability measures, partnerships with the Department of Justice. Denise encouraged him to go. "You have their attention," she said. "People are ready to follow your lead." Malik agreed to the meeting but walked into it with a heavy heart. He sat across from people in suits and ties, some sincere, others simply playing damage control. They asked him what changes he would like to see. He looked them in the eye and answered plainly, "I want you to build something that outlives your fear. Something that still stands when the cameras leave. Don't honor me with speeches. Honor the kids in my neighborhood who don't want to grow up being watched like suspects." One of the council members leaned forward, her expression soft but guarded. "Would you consider joining the task force we're forming?" Malik hesitated. He wasn't sure he wanted to be part of another system. He had just escaped one. He wasn't built for meetings and talking points. He was a man of action. But then he remembered Jalen. The sign he held. The look in his eyes. Maybe there was a place for Malik, not as a politician, but as a protector, once again. Not on the battlefield, but here, in the mess of bureaucracy and change, where the real battles were fought differently. The hardest part came when he visited the youth center again for the first time since everything had happened. The kids swarmed him the moment he walked in. Hugs, cheers, questions he couldn't answer all at once. "Coach, are you famous now? Did they really try to send you to jail? Are they going to jail? Did you win?" Malik knelt to their level, smiled faintly, and answered the only way he could. "I didn't win. I survived. And now I'm going to make sure none of you ever have to fight the same fight." Later that day, he sat in his office, alone, staring at the wall where he used to pin up training schedules and volunteer shifts. Now it held newspaper clippings, framed headlines, and a copy of the Navy commendation letter that had surfaced during the trial. It felt surreal. Almost like it had happened to someone else. He didn't know whether to feel proud or broken. He had exposed a sickness, but doing so had reopened wounds in him that had barely healed. The military had taught him how to face fear, but not how to grieve the cost of being invisible in his own country. That was something he was still learning. Denise called him that evening. Her voice was different, quieter, more personal. I've been offered a position with the Civil Rights Division in D.C. I wouldn't have gotten it if it weren't for this case. For you. Malik didn't know what to say at first. He was happy for her. Grateful. But he also knew she carried the guilt of having almost missed the truth. She continued, I'm not going to pretend I did everything right. But I want to do better. I want to keep fighting for people like you. I hope that means something. Malik finally responded, it does. Just make sure you never forget how close you came to letting someone disappear. Their conversation lingered with him into the night. He walked through his neighborhood, the same streets that once felt ordinary, now transformed. People stopped him, shook his hand, thanked him. Some cried. Others stared in silent admiration. It made him uncomfortable. He hadn't asked for this spotlight. But maybe that discomfort was a sign he still had something real to offer. That he hadn't lost himself in all the noise. What haunted him most wasn't what had been done to him, but what might have happened if he hadn't spoken. If he had taken the plea. If he had swallowed the injustice just to make it end. The fact that the world had almost never heard the truth still kept him up some nights. There were so many others who never got the chance. He walked past murals painted in his honor, graffiti tags that read, Justice for Malik, and though it touched him, it also scared him. Because being a symbol meant people would expect him to keep standing, keep speaking, keep carrying the weight. And he didn't know how long he could hold it. One evening, he received a letter. Handwritten. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The writing was shaky but clear. I was one of the jurors on your case. I believed what they said at first. I was ready to convict you. And when you spoke, you made me realize I've lived my whole life assuming men like you were dangerous. That letter changed me. I don't know how to fix what I've done, but I'm trying to start. Thank you for not staying silent. Malik read it 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it beside the commendation on his wall. Because maybe that was the beginning of something too. A different kind of justice. One that didn't come from courtrooms or verdicts but from people confronting the darkness inside themselves. Still, there was a question that lingered in him. A dilemma he hadn't resolved. What do you do when justice is served but the wound remains? When the system corrects itself, but the pain it caused is still pulsing in your chest? Malik didn't know. But he knew he couldn't walk away. Not yet. Oh ChatGPT. The following weeks became a blur of interviews, meetings, late-night phone calls, and decisions Malik had never asked to be responsible for. His name now opened doors that had always been locked before, justice panels, leadership roundtables, national advocacy groups, and yet every room he entered felt like a negotiation with ghosts. Ghosts of those who had never made it to this moment. He felt the weight of them all. The men wrongly incarcerated without trials, the teenagers profiled on sidewalks, the mothers who never got their sons back. Everyone seemed to want something from him now, his voice, his approval, his presence. But no one really asked how he was holding up. Not Denise, who called him weekly with updates from D.C., proud and excited. Not the city council, who had already started naming initiatives after him. Not the news anchors, who wanted exclusive interviews. They all saw the man who had stood in that courtroom and flipped the entire system on its head, but they didn't see the man who went home every night and sat in silence, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of the praise that came from a tragedy that should have never happened. Malik began attending therapy quietly, on his own terms. He didn't tell anyone, not even his closest friends. The therapist, a middle-aged black woman named Dr. Imani Reynolds, had a presence that made silence feel less lonely. During one session, after Malik spent nearly the entire hour talking about the youth center, the new programs, the pressure, she finally interrupted him gently. You've told me a lot about what you're doing for others. But what are you doing for yourself? Malik looked at her, startled by the question, like it hadn't even occurred to him. "I'm making sure it doesn't happen again," he said, almost like a reflex. She leaned forward, voice softer. "I didn't ask what you're preventing. I asked what you're healing." He didn't answer. Not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know. Somewhere in all the noise, Malik had forgotten what it meant to take care of himself. He had become so focused on carrying the responsibility that he hadn't realized he was still bleeding underneath it all. That night, he didn't go straight home. He drove aimlessly through the city, windows down, the cold air cutting through his jacket like a reminder that he was still here. He passed by the courthouse, then by the police precinct. He didn't stop at either. Instead, he ended up at the waterfront, where the city lights reflected off the dark water like 1,000 broken promises. He sat there for hours, alone with his thoughts, replaying everything, every insult, every assumption, every face that turned away. The next morning, Malik returned to the youth center early. It was still dark when he unlocked the doors, the hallway echoing under his boots. He walked into the gym, turned on the lights, and stood in the middle of the court. The silence was thick, almost sacred. He let out a long breath, like he was finally releasing something he had been holding in too long. A few hours later, the kids would come in, loud and wild and full of questions. But for now, he needed this stillness. And in that stillness, he made a decision. Later that week, he scheduled a public community forum, not for press, not for leaders, but for the people. Held at the local church gymnasium, with folding chairs and no cameras. He stood on a simple platform, wearing a hoodie and jeans, not a suit. The room filled slowly at first, then completely. People from all walks of life came, young, old, skeptical, angry, curious. There were police officers too, off-duty, invited to listen, not speak. Malik began without ceremony. "I didn't come here tonight to be a hero. I came here because I'm still trying to figure out what comes next, and I think maybe some of you are too." There was a stillness that followed, the kind that invites honesty. A woman stood and spoke about her brother who'd been locked up for a crime he didn't commit. A teenager described how he couldn't walk to school without being stopped. An older man said he'd lived here 60 years and nothing had ever changed. Then, something unexpected happened. A uniformed officer, one of the few brave enough to stay, raised his hand. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said carefully. "But I do want to understand. I've been part of this department for 25 years, and what happened to you made me question everything I thought I was doing right." The room held its breath. Malik didn't react right away. He just looked at the man, looked deep into him, as if searching for something underneath the badge and the uniform. "You ever walk into a room and know they've already decided who you are?" The officer nodded slowly. "Not like you have. But I think I understand now." Malik leaned forward, his voice tight with emotion. "Then don't waste that understanding. Take it back to the ones who still don't get it. Because I don't need your apology. I need your courage." The room erupted in applause. But it wasn't the sound that moved Malik. It was the feeling, the collective, raw, vulnerable hunger for change. That night, people didn't go home talking about justice or vengeance. They talked about truth. About the pain of being unseen. About the responsibility that comes once you finally open your eyes. As weeks turned into months, investigations moved forward. The 3 officers were formally charged. Brad Cutler tried to fight it publicly, hiring a lawyer, giving interviews about how his life had been ruined by a misunderstanding. But the facts were too strong. The chat logs too damning. The patterns too undeniable. Jason McNeil quietly accepted a plea deal, agreeing to testify and undergo mandatory civil rights re-education. Rick Travers disappeared from the public eye altogether. But Malik never showed up to their hearings. He didn't need to. The system was handling them now. What he cared about was the conversation happening beyond those walls. Conversations in classrooms, barbershops, city halls. Conversations where people started questioning what they once accepted. One day, Malik received an envelope in the mail. No name. Inside was a short note: "I was your arresting officer. I've left the force. I don't expect forgiveness. But I want you to know I'm not going to pretend I didn't fail you. I did. I failed all of us. I'm sorry." There was no signature. Malik read it 3 times, folded it, and tucked it into the same drawer where he kept the juror's letter. Not because he needed reminders of pain, but because they were proof that people could change. That sometimes, the real verdict comes long after the gavel falls. Still, a question lingered at the edges of Malik's mind, one he couldn't shake. Was redemption enough? Could the men who broke him rebuild anything of value? Or were some things too fractured to be repaired? He didn't know the answer. But he did know this: he would never let them define him again. Not with their words, not with their silence. He was building something now. Something real. And he was doing it with every kid who walked through the center's doors, every officer who chose to listen instead of dominate, every person who decided to confront their own bias, no matter how uncomfortable. Change wasn't a press release. It wasn't a verdict. It was 1,000 decisions made in the dark. And Malik? He had decided to stay in the light. 6 months later, the city had settled into a quiet kind of transformation. Not everything had changed, but something had shifted, deep, structural, undeniable. The police department underwent one of the most rigorous internal audits in its history, and for the first time in decades, reforms were being enacted not for show, not to manage public relations, but because people on the inside had started to understand the cost of silence. The names of officers weren't being quietly transferred anymore, they were being held accountable. Community liaisons were introduced, training protocols overhauled, and leadership at the precincts was replaced with individuals who understood what real justice looked like and who had felt the consequences of failing it. It wasn't perfect, and Malik knew that. But it was a start. And for the first time, he could see the impact rippling in ways that couldn't be undone. As for the 3 officers, their paths diverged, each one marked not by Malik's actions, but by their own choices once the truth came out. Jason McNeil's plea deal included mandatory hours of community service at the youth center where Malik worked. The first day he showed up, the room froze. Kids stared, confused, and a few even walked out. Malik approached him without hesitation, extended a hand, and offered a short nod. "If you're here to serve, serve with humility. These kids don't need to hear about what you did. They need to see what you'll do next." Over time, McNeil kept showing up, not because he had to, but because something in him had begun to shift. He no longer wore a badge, but in those hours, sweeping the gym, helping with homework, mentoring kids on the edge, he found something he'd never expected: clarity. He became a voice in rooms where no one had ever questioned the system, and though the damage couldn't be undone, his silence no longer protected it. Rick Travers left the force entirely, moving to another state under a cloud of shame and quiet legal restrictions. He refused interviews, ignored subpoenas until legal pressure forced him to testify, and remained largely absent from the narrative. But for Malik, that was justice too, not because Rick disappeared, but because his power did. He was no longer protected by a system that once enabled him. And Malik never had to say his name again. That, in itself, was a kind of victory. Brad Cutler, however, resisted until the end. He fought the charges, denied wrongdoing, claimed political persecution, and stood on a crumbling platform of pride. But the evidence was irrefutable. The group chat logs, the inconsistencies in his reports, the dozens of complaints that were now being reviewed, all of it stacked higher than any defense he could muster. His trial became public, brutal, and ultimately conclusive. He was convicted on multiple counts, sentenced to a federal facility, and left behind a name that once commanded fear but now evoked disgrace. And Malik? He never attended that sentencing. He didn't need to. Brad Cutler's fate had already been sealed the moment he chose to laugh in a courtroom he thought belonged to him. Malik, meanwhile, didn't just rebuild his life, he elevated it. The youth center received national attention and funding that allowed for expansion across the city. He was invited to speak at universities, conferences, federal panels, but only accepted the ones that allowed him to bring local kids with him. He turned down book deals and documentaries that wanted to commodify his pain, choosing instead to create a media platform highlighting other stories like his, unheard, unseen, and unjust. The center added a new program under his direction, Justice Literacy. A space where young people could learn about their rights, legal systems, and the power of voice. It wasn't just activism. It was empowerment. He didn't wear suits or pose for photos. He remained the same man who showed up early, locked up late, and cleaned the court floors when no one else did. But now, his presence carried weight in rooms where silence used to dominate. People listened differently. Not because he demanded it, but because they knew what it cost him to finally be heard. One afternoon, he stood on the roof of the center, watching the city stretch out below him. Jalen was beside him, taller now, voice deeper, still carrying the same fire in his eyes. "Coach," he asked, "do you ever wish it hadn't happened?" Malik didn't answer right away. He watched the cars move slowly below, people walking, the sounds of life returning to rhythm. Then he turned to the boy and said, "I wish it hadn't been me. But if it had to happen, I'm glad it happened to someone who refused to let it end quietly." Jalen nodded, understanding more than most kids his age. "I'm gonna be like that too." Malik smiled faintly. "No. You're gonna be better." And just like that, the cycle began again, not in pain, but in purpose. Now, to everyone listening, let's take a breath together. What did you feel throughout this story? Did it make you think about how many people get judged by how they look before anyone ever hears them speak? Did it make you wonder how often we let systems move unchecked because we're too tired, too busy, or too afraid to call them out? This wasn't just a story about one man's dignity being stripped and restored. It was a mirror, held up to all of us. Malik's strength wasn't in his past, or in his title. It was in his choice to stand when the world expected him to bow. His power came not from vengeance, but from transformation. So ask yourself, in your community, in your city, in your everyday interactions, are you the silence that lets injustice breathe? Or the voice that interrupts it? And when the day comes where someone like Malik is standing in front of you, will you be the one who judges, the one who ignores, or the one who listens? Let us know in the comments how this story moved you. What part hit hardest? What do you take with you? And if stories like this matter to you, if you believe in truth, redemption, and powerful comebacks, subscribe to Tales of Twist and be part of this growing community. Your voice matters here. And remember, the real plot twist is when we decide to do better. Together.